Invincible and The Walking Dead are some of the most recognizable comic book IPs. And that's because these are not only some of the most notable TV shows over the past few years, but they're also incredibly successful comics. Comics that notably aren't Marvel or DC comics. The Walking Dead and Invincible comics are written by Robert Kirkman and published by Image Comics. So what is Image Comics? Is it a mainstream comic company? Is it creator owned? Or is it just an indie comic company? Well, depending on who you ask, the answer can vary. So join me in this video as we break down why indie comics aren't what you think. When I think about indie comics, for the longest time, I thought about a company like Image Comics. And a big reason for that was because the genesis of Image Comics felt intrinsically empowering and anti-establishment. Image Comics was founded by artists who worked for both Marvel and DC. These were guys like Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, and Rob Liefeld. Working for the big two comic companies, these artists realized the compensation they got for their work wasn't proportional to the revenue their works earned for Marvel and DC respectively. For example, an artist can work on a Spider-Man comic that sells millions of copies, but that artist won't earn millions of dollars. And the reason for that is because no matter how many Spider-Man comics you draw for Marvel, you'll never own Spider-Man. Realizing that the compensation structure of big comic book companies was unfair towards artists and authors, McFarlane, Lee, Liefeld, and a whole bunch of other creators left Marvel and DC respectively. And thus, Image Comics was created. Image was a creator-owned comics publishing company with a very simple idea at heart. Image publishes your work, but no matter what, you own your work. It was a radical idea that put power back into the hands of the creator. It was bold, disruptive, and wildly successful. So when you think about independent comics, it makes sense that Image Comics would fit into that definition. Image existed independently, outside of the mainstream big two publishing companies. Image was a brand new startup run by a bunch of eager and underpaid artists, but most importantly, Image gave creators complete creative control. It allowed creators to be independent. But today, Image is the third largest direct market comic book publisher. If you go to a comic book store, you will see an Image comic. Hell, Image comics are arguably equally as recognizable as Marvel or DC due to the successes of the Amazon show Invincible or AMC's Walking Dead. So, now that Image Comics makes a bunch of money, are Image Comics still indie? What even makes a comic indie?
So when some people say indie, they hear creator owned. But on the smaller end, when you get past the Image Comics, the Boom, the Dark Horse, the IDW, even though those are awesome and creator owned, they're really not on the indie side these days. Those publishers are gigantic. They have a lot of money. They throw a lot of money at creators when they can.
This is TS. TS is a indie comic author through and through. He's raised $20,000 in joint crowdfunding and publisher financing efforts in order to print, sell, and advertise his own books. He's written books like Alice Lost in Wonderland by Mr. Fish Comics, Hellion and Bash, published by Professional Entropy, Tokyo Fire, also published by Professional Entropy, and he has a new book coming out that I'm very excited for called The Digger, which will be published by Invader Comics. Long story short, TS knows a thing or two about indie comics, and as a creator of indie comics, his definition is a lot different than the definition I would have expected.
So with indie comics, sometimes when I say indie, you mean not Marvel or DC. When we talk about indie today, you're often talking about people like me, people who are making comic books in their bedroom with friends, like TMNT back in the old days when you would make an ash can copy, reprint it out on your own printer, take it into your local comic book store, and hope somebody wants to buy it. That's a lot of what we do. We just do it in today's age, which means our books come out a lot better. We get to put them on marketplaces. You can also have crowdfunding, which means a lot of us take them to places like Kickstarter or Zoop or Indiegogo, and we self-finance up front, hope that we make it back on the Kickstarter, and put out whatever book that we can.
Thinking about this definition in context today, it makes a lot of sense. Image Comics' Invincible property received a hefty $2.5 million budget per episode. Based on that number alone, it's difficult to think of Image Comics as a rough and tumble, pull yourself up by your bootstraps type of company. These days, Image Comics get shmoney. According to online estimates, Image Comics' annual earnings since nicely at a whopping 70 million. Sure, Image still allows artists and authors to publish creator-owned series, but in that same vein, Image also licenses out popular franchise IPs. One of the most popular Image comics of the past year, Transformers by Daniel Warren Johnson, is a series published by Image because Image acquired the Transformers IP from IDW, meaning that when Daniel Warren Johnson writes and draws Transformers, he gets paid, but he doesn't own Transformers. On top of all that, Image has a robust foothold on the comic book distribution marketplace.
Image Comics doesn't put a ton of money into the project. What they bring to the table is their clout, right? The Image Comics is a giant company that people know and recognize, so when they slap their label on it, people are going to check it out just because it's Image. They do help solicit, but the creators who put out a project at Image Comics mostly do their own marketing, mostly do their own soliciting. They get a lot of help for a lot of the back end stuff through Image, but they still handle it all themselves. So I can't even put the tag on indie as saying, hey, you do it all yourself, because you still do that depending on where you're at. For me, indie is a lot of how you're recognized in the industry. If people know the publisher that you're working with, often or not, I wouldn't call that indie.
I'll be honest, when I originally hit up TS to talk to him and do an interview about indie comics, I really wanted to focus on the idea of creator-owned IPs versus IPs owned by bigger distribution companies like Marvel and DC. I wanted to talk about how that ownership looked different and why indie comics are so important, because they allow creators to profit from their works in ways that is unimaginable at a place like Marvel or DC. I wanted to break down how companies like Marvel had a bad track record when it comes to treating their creators. For example, Ed Brubaker is responsible for creating the character the Winter Soldier, yet despite penning a character who would earn the company billions of dollars, all he got for creating the Winter Soldier storyline was, quote, a thanks here or there. I wanted to break down how artists and authors at Marvel have been vocally outspoken about this lack of equitable treatment. And I wanted to utilize the image of indie comics as a way to showcase how and why creator-owned work is so vital in today's day and age. But that entire video idea came crumbling down when I talked to TS, and I realized indie comics weren't what I thought they were. Granted,
the definition of indie is subjective. Everybody defines it as something different, but I can tell you that I talk to a lot of creators who do work for Marvel and DC and those larger publishers like Image and do creator-owned books, and they call it creator-owned. They don't call it indie when they do their books. They talk about coming from indie, and they talk about how a lot of those companies used to be indie with how it was operated. But with what it looks like on a shelf at a comic book store, most people wouldn't call those other publishers indie in the same way that they were 10, 15 years ago even.
All of this to say, this video isn't supposed to be a aha gotcha moment. I'm not sitting on my pedestal saying, you didn't know what indie comics are because you're silly and stupid. Because yeah, the definition of indie comics is in fact subjective. On top of that, a publisher like Image giving creators the rights to own their work is a super important and noble mission statement. And even if creator-owned companies aren't traditionally indie comic companies, they still deserve to be championed for their efforts. I guess I'm hoping this video starts a discourse, sparks discussion, and potentially gets viewers to view indie comics through a new light. Because at the end of the day, art is raw, it's vulnerable, and it's one of the most difficult things to create earnestly. And when we as consumers dumb something down to the arbitrary label of either indie or mainstream, it homogenizes the industry. It ignores the blood, sweat, and tears of the creators, and it codifies the binary of comics to fit within a singular and definitive process. But the truth is, that process looks different for every piece of art you consume. When I talked to TS, I realized the labor of love he puts into every single one of his comics, but I also realized that every single one of his comics was published through a different company. It was published through different funding means. It was advertised in different ways. The way that book gets into the consumer's hands is different every single time. So if you take one idea from this video, take this. The passion and creativity artists put into their comics should be appreciated and described as something deeper than the label of indie or not indie. Understand that the comic book creation, publishing, and distribution process looks different for everyone. Whether you work at Marvel, DC, Image, or you self-publish, the process of a story starting as a simple little idea in someone's mind and turning into a physical story held in the hands of consumers is a long and difficult task that deserves respect. Consuming art, criticizing art, and ignoring art is so easy, but making art is one of the most difficult things you can do. Anyway, that's the video. Hope you guys have enjoyed. If you guys like TS and want to check out his books, I linked his website down below, Can't Be Killed Comics. Be sure to check out his work, it's fantastic. I love Hellion and Bash, Tokyo Fire, and I'm super excited for The Digger. He always puts out bangers. But as always, hope y'all enjoyed. Thank you for watching.